right. Thank you, Dr. Stewart. It is my pleasure to be with you guys this morning for Defend 2018. When Dr. Stewart birthed this program, I was right alongside him. I was his assistant at that particular point in time, and we were working our tails off. You think this is a long week now. We started this conference going from Sunday night through Friday night. It was a much longer program then, and I had the opportunity to lead it for a little while, but I decided this was too much for me, and I handed it right back to Dr. Stewart. So I'm glad that he did that for us. So today I want to talk about a pretty important question, and that is the question of the authentic Jesus. And this is a question that is probably pretty practical for a great number of reasons. But in my house, like Dr. Stewart said, I have small children, and I get bombarded with a lot of questions, and I mean a lot of questions. There are questions left and right, and some of them are pretty interesting questions. Like my son, not too long ago, asked me, "Bears don't wear shoes, do they, Dad?" And I said, "No, they don't. That's why they call it bare feet when you don't wear shoes, right?" And I said, "Yeah, that makes sense." And then sometimes he asks these profound theological questions, like, why does God make some people bald? And the simple answer is, son, they have too much sin in their life. And then there are those really profound theological questions that I wrestle with as an adult, and that is, if God is all good and God is all powerful, why does Alabama keep on playing in the national title game? The problem of evil spelled out for you right there. But I think the most important question that's ever been asked is a question that Jesus himself raised when he was talking with his disciples. And he asked the disciples a very simple question, and that was, who do people say that I am? Who do people say that I am? And they answered, of course, John the Baptist, others Elijah, and one of the prophets. And so the broader culture has its own perception of Jesus. One of the things that we sometimes see from the broader culture is that they perceive Jesus to be like a drinking buddy. Jesus is just all right with me. Jesus is my homeboy. Jesus and I are tight. Jesus is the man upstairs. We see these sort of designations applied to Jesus all the time. And then sometimes we see Jesus used as sort of a pawn in our political discussions. Jesus was the original guy to feel the burn, and his followers had clever signs like this: who needs oil? I ride the bus. I'll let you think about that for a second. I will not quietly go back into the 1950s. And then there's this picture that some people have of Jesus where he's probably walking around with a Make America Great hat again and fighting for our gun rights. And so what you sometimes see with followers of Jesus, regardless of whether they're Democratic or Republican, that somehow, some way, their political views are the same exact views that Jesus himself had. Jesus shared their opinions about everything. And then sometimes we see this perception of Jesus, that Jesus was but a mere prophet. And this is really sort of the central view of Jesus in Islam, that Jesus is an elevated prophet. He might be the Messiah in one sense, but not in the sense that we as Christians teach. He is a mere prophet, and he is something fundamentally different than the Jesus of Christianity, of orthodoxy. We have the view that Jesus was a lesser deity created by God. In fact, what I really love here about this particular vision of Jesus put by the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and you can thank the intellectual property guys that own these pictures, but have you noticed that Jesus and Joseph Smith sort of resemble one another just a little bit? It's sort of like you make Jesus in your own image. Jesus was a polygamist, sort of prophet teacher like I am. and Jesus is also part of apparently a wrestling team here with God the Father, Heavenly Father. And then, of course, Jesus shows up to preach to the Native Americans, and that's a whole nother story. But, of course, in Mormonism, Jesus is a created being, just in some sense like the Father himself was a created being, that he too was once a man who became a God. And, of course, this is not the answer to the question that we normally give, or hopefully the question we don't normally give. And then there's the view that Jesus was merely an angel, like we see from the Watchtower Bible and Tract Society, a.k.a. the Jehovah's Witnesses. Now, my wife probably wouldn't let me get away with this, but I would hang Jehovah's Witness artwork up in my house if I could, all right? There's just something wonderfully kitschy about it. Look at this picture here. The world is going to hell in a handbasket in the background, and they're sitting there and they're happy about it, all right? And so I just sort of like this. I don't know what it is. But of course, Jehovah's Witnesses make a big deal out of strange things, like Jesus wasn't hanging on a cross. He was hanging on a stake, which I'm not really sure why that debate really matters all that much. The more significant ones, again, are those related to Jesus' divinity. These claims, these assertions that Jesus was not truly divine, that Jesus was some sort of archangel who became man. And then we have the view that's perpetuated by a lot of people who are in Eastern thinking or in New Age thinking. The idea that Jesus was an enlightened teacher, a guru who was not really unique from Buddha, not really unique from Confucius, not really unique from other enlightened teachers in history. He was someone who had an elevated sense of the God consciousness, the same sort of God consciousness that you and I can tap into when we recognize and realize that we are one and the same with God, and God is one and the same with everything around us. So, this is a sort of a New Age vision of Jesus that's had this sort of blend of Hinduism, Buddhism, and a couple of other worldviews. But it's certainly not a traditional Christian belief about Jesus. Now, pictured here on the far left is a book that came out in the 1960s by a very well-known Dead Sea Scroll scholar. His name was John Allegro. He wrote a book called The Sacred Mushroom and the Cross. An important book, maybe for your devotional life, I'm sure. It's the idea that Jesus was a mushroom. You ready for this? Jesus was a mushroom. He and his disciples, just keep in mind this was the 1960s, okay? And apparently there was a lot of good product being carried around. But John Allegro had this idea that he saw in early Christian artwork mushrooms everywhere, and that conceived of this notion of Jesus as a figment of the disciples' mushroom-induced imagination. Jesus was a fungus among us, all right, in this particular scheme. Now, of course, in this scheme, Jesus is just a figment of their imagination, their hallucinations. There are other, more sophisticated arguments that have since been developed that says that Jesus is a mere figment of the disciples' imagination, that they have created these complicated myths about Jesus, but there was no historical Jesus. And perhaps the most well-known advocate of this particular position today is pictured here in the middle. That's Robert M. Price, who most scholars, even liberal scholars, even agnostic scholars like Bart Ehrman, discount what Robert Price has to say. But that doesn't mean that this isn't a somewhat popular view, because several years ago there was a Netflix documentary, or a documentary that you can find on Netflix called The God Who Wasn't There. Very well known. There's other conspiracy theory movies out there, like the Zeitgeist movie, that try to sell this picture that Jesus is just a historical construct, that he did not, in fact, exist in history. And I'm not going to really address that today, though there are lots of good resources out there that do address that particular view. And then there's this idea that Jesus was merely a political revolutionary, that Jesus was merely a political revolutionary. And pictured here in the middle is John Dominic Crossan, Dom Crossan, who was the co-chair of the Jesus Seminar with Robert Funk. You know, with a name like Robert Funk, I mean, that's the sort of appropriate title for him to have. But the Jesus Seminar was basically a group of scholars, really comprised from 3 or 4 of the liberal religion departments and divinity schools in the United States back in the 80s and 90s. And they sold a lot of books, moved a lot of product, were featured on a lot of these, specials that showed up around Christmas or Easter, selling just sort of these various different visions of Jesus, all of which were a radical departure from the traditional view of Christian faith. That Jesus was merely a revolutionary political figure, that Jesus did not ever in any capacity claim to be God, that all of these things that were said about Jesus by the church councils and the later creeds, these were made up and completely separate from what the Scripture itself presents. And then, of course, there is the answer to this question that we see in traditional Christian belief. And that's what's stated in creeds like the Chalcedonian Creed of 451, that Jesus is truly God and he is truly man. I mean, this is an assertion that, any Orthodox Christian would make, but is this the particular sort of answer that is the appropriate answer? And that's sort of what I want to try to sketch out today. And what I want to do today, this is not really, purely speaking, an apologetic presentation. Some of this is just theological, and I want you to be able to do this with a Bible in hand, kind of showing maybe to a skeptical friend who has questions or concerns about traditional Christian belief, how you can make a case for this particular answer, that Jesus is in fact truly God and truly man, in sort of a clear, easy-to-use way. So, Jesus turns the question on the disciples. He says, okay, that's what the broader culture says about me. What do you say about me? Who do you say that I am? And of course, I was an 80s baby. I grew up in the 90s. I can't help but think about, with a real Slim Shady, please stand up, okay? Some of you are like, who is that blonde guy? Okay, I feel a little bit older now that you're just sort of giving me this dazed look. But yeah, the question is, will the real Jesus Christ please stand up? We want to know who the genuine Jesus is. And there's some unique challenges that we have when we're trying to address this question as Christians. One of which is this: Jesus never explicitly tells us, I am God. Yes, our creeds do say that explicitly, that Jesus is truly God, that he is of one substance with the Father, that he is of one substance with the Spirit. We have these statements very explicitly drawn out in the creeds, but the problem is, in Jesus' own words, these are never said. It's also explicitly said in other places throughout the New Testament, but never does Jesus himself explicitly use these phrases. Never does he come out and say, hey, y'all, I'm the second person of the Trinity. I think that would have been very helpful had he chosen to do that. Sometimes I wonder why he didn't, and why God didn't inspire a nice, orderly, systematic theology textbook. But that's not the way Revelation was delivered to us. But of course, there are some texts that I think we might appeal to. I mean, right off the top of our head. I think one of the things that I would jump to, and if I were to sort of, address this particular claim, might be things said from the Gospel of John. Jesus said, "Your father Abraham rejoiced to see my day. He saw it, and he was glad." And the Jews replied, "You aren't even 50 years old yet. How can you claim to have seen Abraham?" And Jesus said to them, "Truly I tell you, before Abraham was, ego eimi, I am." All right? And of course, we know, reading this text, that this is a callback to the name that God revealed with himself to Moses. And it's pretty clear even to the immediate audience, because what we see here in the text is that they picked up stones to stone Jesus. But Jesus was hidden, and he went out of the temple. Another text that you might think about, that might come to mind right off the top of your head, is from John chapter 10, verse 30. Jesus says, "I and the Father are one." I and the Father are one. Now again, we could put some sort of New Age spin on this and say that Jesus was, again, an elevated guru teaching this sort of elevated God consciousness, and that he's sort of just teaching this New Age view that I'm one with God just like you're one with God. We're all one and the same thing, this sort of pantheistic worldview. But that's clearly not what Jesus is doing in the context. And what we see in this text is the response of the Jews being the Jewish religious leadership. That's not a general phrase about all Jews. That's a Johannine way of describing the Jewish religious leadership that was intimidated by Jesus. The Jews picked up rocks to stone him. So, what we find here, Jesus says, "I have shown you many good works from my Father. For which of these works are you stoning me?" And then they answered this in verse 33. This is, again, pretty significant. He says, "We aren't stoning you for a good work," the Jews answered, "but for blasphemy, because you, being a man, make yourself God." So it's very clear, at least in John's accounts, that Jesus is making these assertions about his own divinity. And the immediate response of the Jewish religious leadership was, he's being blasphemous. They're interpreting what he's saying, I think, in a pretty straightforward way. And there's a good indicator of what Jesus means to say by how they take it, okay? They assume that Jesus is, in fact, claiming to be God, because I think that's absolutely correct. Now, the question is this going to be something that the general public buys? Well, it depends on whom you're speaking with. A lot of people have a lot of trouble going straight to John for reasons like this. Let me read to you from Bart Ehrman. Bart Ehrman, of course, is a pretty provocative figure, a controversial figure. We've had him on this campus several times for several different Greer Herd forums and events. But he's a former evangelical Christian, former Baptist pastor, turned sort of atheist, agnostic New Testament scholar. And he's had a lot of success, written a lot of books, had a lot of influence in shaping people's views about the New Testament and about Jesus. And this is what he says in a fairly recent interview, dating back for about 3 years. "The problem is that Jesus only makes claims for himself as being divine in the Gospel of John." All right? That's the first thing he says is, Jesus only claimed to be divine in the Gospel of John. But what scholars have long noted is that Jesus doesn't say any of those things in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And that Matthew, Mark, and Luke are written much earlier than John. What I argue in the book, and he's promoting a book that he's recently written called When God Became Man, is that it's virtually inconceivable that if it was known Jesus called himself God, that Matthew, Mark, and Luke would just leave that out. Okay, so the claim that Ehrman is making is simply this, that only in the Gospel of John do we find these claims about Jesus claiming to be divine, all right? These are later claims. The Gospel of John does not represent the historical Jesus as much as the Gospel of John represents the later Christian community that has developed these beliefs about Jesus. The best source for Jesus' life are the Synoptic Gospels. The best sources are the Synoptic Gospels, particularly Mark. Mark is the earliest written gospel, and he's making this claim that we do not find assertions about Jesus' divinity in these particular gospels. And if Jesus actually were to make these sort of claims, you would think that these earliest gospel writers would have included them. So Ehrman's thesis has sort of developed a little bit over time. I've heard him say something very much like this in this very room, probably nearly 10 years ago. But some of his views have sort of mutated and changed a little bit since then. His original thesis was that only John described Jesus as divine, and that Matthew, Mark, and Luke describe Jesus as human. I meant to be Luke there. So Matthew, Mark, and Luke describe Jesus as human. John describes Jesus as divine. All right? But he's since sort of revised this thesis. He's changed this particular point of view or perspective in his more recent works. He says that only John has an incarnational theology that teaches God became man. The Synoptics, on the other hand, teach Jesus to be an exalted man. So what he's saying is there is a sense in which all four Gospels describe Jesus as divine. So this is a mutation from Ehrman's earlier thought, okay? There's a sense in which all four Gospel writers want to say Jesus is divine. But what we mean by that is very different across the Gospels. Because the sort of traditional Christian belief that God became man is limited only to John. The Word became flesh. We do not have that particular Christology elsewhere across the Gospels. Rather, what he says in Mark and in Matthew and in Luke, you have what we would later call something like an adoptionist Christology. That Jesus was a mere human being who was sort of elevated or exalted to this position of divine. But when we call Jesus divine in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, we do not mean what we mean when we talk about John. So that's the sort of question I want to raise is this really a helpful way of thinking about the Synoptic Gospels, about the earliest sources of Jesus? One thing that I think we absolutely have to keep in mind whenever we think about this question, and this is going to be the most important sort of background point for anything we do when we're discussing Jesus' divinity in the Gospels, is that Jesus lived in a Jewish, strongly monotheistic context. A Jewish and strongly monotheistic context. And this is something that sort of evolves over time, develops over time in the life of Israel, really from the time that Moses receives the law till the time of Jesus. If you read the Old Testament, if you have any familiarity with what goes on in the various kings of Israel, the various kings of Judah, is that there is a lot of idolatry that goes on. There's a lot of borrowing from neighbor deities. There's a practice that's sometimes in place called henotheism, which is essentially like saying, Yahweh is my God, but I respect the fact that my pagan neighbors have their own gods and their own gods serve them well, but God is my team. Yahweh is my team. Sort of like I'm a Saints fan. Who dat? That was met with no enthusiasm. So you must be Panthers fans or something. I don't know. Sorry. No, didn't mean to do that to you. But anyway, maybe they're all under concussion protocol or something. There you go. So I don't really know where I was going quite with that. But the point being, there was this view that was circulating in Judaism for some time that yes, Yahweh is my God, but there are these other neighboring gods, and He's on my team. Y'all have your own team. We have our own God. But over time, through various things like God's judgment on the northern kingdom, through God's judgment on Judah, through the exile of Babylon, all these things that sort of play out, there is a stronger commitment to monotheism that develops. Monotheism is at the heart of the synagogue system, that no matter where they go, no matter where the Jewish people are, they can take the one true God with them. All right? So monotheism is a big deal. If you start talking about bringing other gods into the picture, this is a radical distortion of Judaism. So that's absolutely something that's essential to understanding the way that these earliest Gospels would have been formed and shaped. So I think it's significant when we look back at the sort of things that the earliest Gospel writer says about Jesus. The earliest Gospel writer. And again, I'm just assuming here Mark in priority. So let's just assume for a second, and I don't mean what I'm about to say, but let's just assume for a second that John is not a credible source. Let's just assume, like the broader unbelieving biblical scholarship, that John is not that credible of a source, that John is really more of a collection of things that are stated about what Jesus' believers say rather than what Jesus himself says. What does this earliest source, this most reliable source, make out about Jesus? What does Mark think? So this is just a thing I think I can encourage you. You can pull out a Bible. You can highlight these things in your Gospel of Mark and just take an opportunity to go back and do this later. And these are things that you can just show to someone if you're having this sort of conversation. If you can get them to the point where they would admit it to you, yeah, I think Mark might be a good source for understanding and knowing Jesus, then you can sort of delve in from this particular point of view. And again, this is more theological than it is really apologetic. Mark begins and ends his gospel describing Jesus as the Son of God. So Mark begins and ends his gospel describing Jesus as the Son of God. These are important things that are stated on both sides of the gospel. And God the Father declares Jesus to be his beloved Son, with whom he is well pleased, in multiple places here in Mark. So we have it at the baptism of Jesus. We also have it at the transfiguration of Jesus. So God the Father declares Jesus to be his beloved Son, with whom he is well pleased. So both of those things are in the text. All right? We also see that Jesus has authority over spiritual powers. He has authority over spiritual powers like demonic spirits. Now again, on this side of the coming of Jesus, we don't think of this as something exclusive as belonging to Jesus. This is something we think of as Christian believers having in general. I've seen some pretty remarkable things. I've seen, I believe, Christians do some remarkable things in response to demonic powers. It's nothing I saw Benny Hinn do on TBN, but I do believe that this is something believers can do and do have the ability to do. But Jesus himself is unique in the sense that he's the first one really to exhibit this sort of power. Demonic spirits always recognize Jesus as the Son of God. And one of the things, again, that's so fascinating to me about the way that Mark tells his story is that Jesus is always trying to silence these demons who are about to out him as the Son of God. They're about to out him. They're about to reveal to the world who he is, and he's shutting them up. And there's this sort of theme that sometimes is called the messianic secret in the Gospel of Mark, that Jesus keeps his messianic identity sort of hidden from people until the end when he's about to be crucified for reasons that make a lot of sense in the historical context, because Jesus would not want to incite the sort of rebellion, the sort of political revolution that many, so-called messiahs did try to do in Jesus' own day and age. Jesus had something very different envisioned for the coming kingdom of God. But we do see that demonic spirits always recognize Jesus as the Son of God. We also see that Jesus had authority and power over human sickness. And this is something that's, again, an oft-repeated theme throughout the healing accounts, that Jesus ultimately has authority to heal. Jesus has the power to heal. Jesus has the power to bring dead men to life. We see that angels serve Jesus. Angels serve Jesus. And I also want to point out, this is something that I don't think we should overlook, is that Mark emphasizes repeatedly that Jesus felt significant human emotions. So I think there's a temptation on the part of some Bible scholars when they're thinking about Mark or when they're thinking about John that, Mark only portrays Jesus as human, or John only portrays Jesus as divine, when the reality is there's both ends of the pole in both of these Gospels. In John, of course, I think displays Jesus' emotion in significant ways, when, of course, the most quotable passage in the entire New Testament is in John, right? John 11:35. Jesus wept, all right? So there's a very clear description of Jesus' emotions there, that Jesus has genuine human feeling, that Jesus has genuine humanity, even in John. But I don't want to ignore that in Mark as well, all right? So we have that particular point of view there. We see that the forces of nature obey Jesus' word. And again, this is a pretty significant thing for just a mere human being to have. Jesus speaks to the weather. Jesus silences the storm. Jesus has power over nature. These are things that no mere human prophet or political revolutionary, or fill in the blank with whatever you want to describe Jesus' agenda and Mark as doing. Jesus is doing some pretty unique things here in this text. And of course, Jesus has power over death itself. Jesus has power over death itself with the sort of miraculous raisings from the dead, like the raising of Jairus' daughter. Jesus has power over death itself. Jesus has power to address every human need, and Jesus even has authority over human traditions. Jesus has authority over human traditions, like Sabbath laws. Jesus has authority over those things. And Jesus knew genuine human suffering. I do not want to ignore this when we're talking about Mark's picture of Jesus. Jesus knew genuine human suffering. And Jesus even claimed to have authority over the law of Moses. Now, this is a big, stinking deal in Second Temple Judaism, all right? For lack of a better theological term, it is a big, stinking deal, okay? Jesus asserted that he had authority to revise the law of Moses, that he could speak over Moses, over and against Moses. He had some sort of authority over what was written in the law of Moses. And it sort of reminds me of that scene in the Chronicles of Narnia when Aslan is talking to the witch, and the witch says, "How do I know?" She says that you're going to follow what the law has said. How do I know that you're going to keep the magic? And Aslan says, I was there when the law was written. This is Jesus having authority over the law of Moses because it is his law, all right? And he makes these sort of assertions here in the text. Jesus himself is greater than the temple, which again in Second Temple Judaism is the centerpiece of Jewish thinking. He's greater than the temple itself, which is the central symbol of Israel's faith. Jesus envisions himself as the fulfillment of Israel's scriptures and as the true king of Israel, the descendant of David. Now, again, these things don't necessarily mean that Jesus believes himself to be divine, but it does mean that Jesus thinks pretty highly of himself. He thinks that he is a real stable genius. Watch the news, y'all. Watch the news, okay? It'll inform you with some interesting things. So Jesus believes himself to be the true king of Israel. And then again, Jesus does things that, again, no ordinary Jew would do. Jesus believed that he had the authority on earth to forgive sins. Jesus believed that he had the authority on earth to forgive sins. And I think that is a remarkable statement. You know, people recognize only God can forgive sins. Who do you think that you are? And we see that from the context Jesus makes when he makes this claim. And of course, he's talking about healing the paralytic in that particular passage. Jesus suggested that his disciples do not need to fast when they were in his presence. Jesus suggested that the disciples did not need to fast when they were in his presence. And that's pretty remarkable, right? I mean, we think about fasting as a way to get close to God, to experience God's presence. And Jesus sort of asserts that when you're in my presence, you don't need to fast because you are in God's presence. And again, that's a pretty bold claim coming from this man in the Gospel of Mark, who many scholars treat to be as merely human. But I think the most significant passage, if I were going to go to a passage in the Gospel of Mark, that talks about Jesus' self-perception, the way that Jesus sees and understands himself in the Gospel of Mark, it's from Mark chapter 14. Mark chapter 14. And this is Jesus' behavior before the Sanhedrin, the night before he was crucified. During this illegal trial, how does Jesus carry himself? How does Jesus understand himself? And again, these are significant things that Jesus says. We see here in verse 60, the high priest stood before them all, and he questioned Jesus. Don't you have an answer to what these men are testifying against you? But Jesus remained silent, and he gave no answer. Again, the high priest asked him, are you the Messiah, the Son of the Blessed One? Jesus says in Mark, I am, said Jesus, and you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power, coming with the clouds of heaven. Now, if you were reading over this real quickly, you might just say, oh yeah, Jesus claimed to be the Messiah. Jesus claimed that he was coming again. What's the big deal here? But even here in the Gospel of Mark, if you understand the sort of textual allusions that Jesus is making back to the Old Testament, you will get a picture of exactly what Jesus is claiming about himself. And we see this comparison between Mark 14:62 and Psalm 110:1. Notice what Jesus says. And you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the Mighty One. And of course, this again is a callback to what David says in Psalm 110:1. The Lord says to my Lord, sit at my right hand until I make your enemies a footstool for your feet. So this is a textual allusion, again calling back to Psalm 110:1. But the most significant textual allusion, I think, is the latter part of that verse. And that calls back to Daniel 7:13. Jesus says, I am, and you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the Mighty One and coming on the clouds of heaven. All right? The Son of Man is a fairly common title that Jesus gives to himself in the Synoptic Gospels. The Son of Man has a number of different connotations throughout the Old Testament. In some places, it refers merely to human beings. I think that's what you see quite frequently, like in places like Psalm 8. In some places, I think it has a special sort of designation or description of people who live in contrast to the sons of God, like what we see in Genesis 6. Then in some places, it's sort of a description of a particular individual who's got a prophetic role or a prophetic purpose. That was Ezekiel's nickname that God sort of gave him, Son of Man. Every time that God sort of speaks to Ezekiel, he calls him the Son of Man or Son of Man. And so you do see various uses of Son of Adam, Son of Man, Ben Adam, throughout the Old Testament. But really, I think the most important use of the term Son of Man for understanding Jesus, and this particular text right here brings it out, is from Daniel chapter 7. And Daniel chapter 7 gives this sort of prophetic vision of the Ancient of Days coming out and bestowing on the Son of Man this sort of heavenly scene of worship, this heavenly authority that's been granted to the Son of Man. And we see this. Daniel says this, and there was before me one like a Son of Man, coming with the clouds of heaven. There was before me one like a Son of Man, coming with the clouds of heaven. Let me just read the rest of this passage. He approached the Ancient of Days and was led into his presence. He was given authority, glory, and sovereign power. And all nations and peoples of every language worshiped him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion that will not pass away. And his kingdom is one that will never be destroyed. I mean, again, this is a pretty significant description of the Son of Man. He's being worshiped by all nations and all peoples. He's been given a kingdom that is an everlasting kingdom. I mean, this is a reference to a clearly divine figure. And when Jesus is making this allusion back to Daniel 7, describing himself, the Jewish religious leadership that's hearing what Jesus has to say immediately knows what Jesus is doing. They immediately pick up on what Jesus is doing. In fact, the reaction that they have is indicative of what we see here in the Gospel of Mark as a claim that Jesus is making to being divine. Look at what unfolds. The high priest then tore his robes and said, "Why do we still need witnesses? You have heard the blasphemy. What is your decision?" And they all condemned him as deserving death. Then some began to spit on him, to blindfold him, and to beat him, saying, "Prophesy." The temple servants also took him and slapped him. All right? So this is, again, a pretty clear indication that they know what Jesus is saying here in this passage. In fact, what I find remarkable when I see their particular response here in Mark is that it's nearly identical to the sort of reaction that the Jewish religious leadership makes in John 8:59 and John 10:33. When Jesus claims to be one with the Father, and when Jesus claims that before Abraham was, I am, and they want to stone him, they accuse him of blasphemy. They say that you're asserting to be God. The same sort of visceral reaction erupts here in the Gospel of Mark. Not just John, but in the earliest source and tradition for Jesus. Here in the Gospel of Mark, when Jesus makes this allusion back to Daniel 7. Now, I've heard people like Rhyne try to offer some alternative explanations to this allusion that Jesus makes to the Son of Man in Daniel chapter 7. One of the things that Bart once said, again, in this room, I remember him saying it, he said that, Jesus here is speaking about another person who is coming, the Son of Man. He's not being self-referential. Jesus is speaking about a third person, a different individual, not speaking about himself in the third person. And again, you would think that were that the case, that when the Sanhedrin goes ballistic for Jesus making these sort of claims and they start to beat him, he could step up and say, hey, time out, guys. I'm talking about someone else. Or that maybe if Mark didn't believe in the divinity of Jesus, that Mark would step in and say they misunderstood what Jesus was saying. But no such claims emerge from the text. We just see that Jesus is making this allusion that, again, is completely consistent with everything that he has said in public to this point throughout the Synoptic Gospels. So, in sum, it appears that Jesus believed that he was equal to God in authority, worthy of worship, worthy of glory, worthy of power. Jesus was asserting who he was. And in summary, the cumulative evidence from the Gospel of Mark seems more consistent with the traditional belief in Jesus' divinity than some of these alternative proposals. It seems like it's the most consistent thing when you look across the board, again, at all of these things that Mark says about Jesus, all these things that Jesus says about himself and that Jesus does throughout the gospel, that Jesus, in fact, believes himself to be divine. And not just in the sense that the later Rhyne has suggested. To the claim, as the later Rhyne suggests, that Mark taught an adoptionist Christology in which Jesus was an exalted man is more inconsistent with Jewish monotheism than the belief that Jesus is God who became man. So let me explain what I mean. Again, in a rigorously monotheistic context, where you worship one God as the one true God, what makes more sense for Jews to believe? That the one true God became man, or that the one true God would elevate another man to be worshipped as a God alongside himself? What's more consistent with Jewish monotheism? The adoptionist Christology or the traditional Christian belief? And it seems to me that the traditional Christian belief that we see here, I think pretty clearly laid out in Mark, is more consistent with monotheism than this sort of revisionist Christology that Rhyne and others are finding in the text. I would also note, and again I've said this before, Mark does not shy away from showcasing Jesus' human suffering and emotion. But such descriptions do not necessarily preclude a divine picture as well. We want to assert that Jesus was truly human in the Gospel of Mark. We want to assert that Jesus is truly human in Matthew and Luke. Those things do not cause any sort of confusion or difficulty for our beliefs about Jesus. Because in Orthodox Christian belief, we emphasize Jesus' humanity. Apart from Jesus' humanity, really the Christian story can't be true, because it is God coming into our world and experiencing true humanity like ours. And we want to emphasize Jesus' true divinity as well as Jesus' true humanity. And that really about sums up what I think the Mark is saying about Jesus. That Mark paints a picture that, again, is very consistent with Christian orthodoxy, very consistent with what's been described before, and consistent with John. I mean, I do believe the Gospel of John, but it's sort of a practical approach. Sometimes I just say, okay, let's just set John aside and say, let's go to Mark. If you want to give Mark some historical credibility, then let's look at Mark and see what Mark has to say about Jesus. Now, I'm not, in this presentation, answering some of the questions of people like Bob Price, who assert that Jesus did not exist. I mean, there's another time for that presentation. Dr. Stewart has done some fine work on that as well. Even Bart Ehrman has responded in a way that sort of takes our side on that issue. In fact, when he says that Jesus did in fact exist in history. But when we're responding to people who give some credence to Mark, I think that you can make the case that Mark teaches something very consistent with what Christians have traditionally held and believed.
I mean, to me, when you lay these verses out, it kind of seems pretty black and white. How do these guys, how do they combat something like that?
Yeah, I mean, there's a long tradition that really kind of goes back to the Enlightenment, where we see that people want to make a radical distinction between what they call the Christ of faith and the Jesus of history. And a lot of that really in the Enlightenment just sort of came out of deist presuppositions that there may be some sort of God who creates the world, but he's not really involved and engaged the way that the New Testament or the way the Bible claims that he is.
So he really wouldn't take the words of Mark either to be...
Well, I mean, in part. I mean, if you look at someone like Ehrman thinks that Mark is the best resource we have for knowing Jesus. And Ehrman will affirm that Jesus existed in history, and that Mark gives us the best picture because it's the earliest picture. And gospel, they'll claim things like Mark is written around 70 A.D., and that's usually kind of the date that they give for Mark. I think there's reasons for dating Mark even earlier than that. I won't get into here, but I think that they're going to agree with the general picture of Mark. The issue is that they have some interpretive differences as to how they see Jesus envisioning himself in these passages.
Bart Ehrman seems to indicate that the Christology developed through the Gospels. So I'm just wondering, do you think there was any development, or do you think it was all kind of there in Mark and they're just kind of showing it more in the other Gospels?
Well, yeah, I think Christology does develop. I mean, and when I say Christology does develop, I don't mean that Christology is invented from nothing, okay? I mean that there is a clear understanding of Jesus that develops over time. I mean, that's clear in the life of the disciples. I mean, the life of the disciples, they were following Jesus around, but they were still sort of clueless until after the resurrection. And then even after Pentecost, they have an even clearer understanding of Jesus. So, I mean, yes, Christology does develop over time. And I don't hesitate to think that, you have early oral traditions that, they come together and they're starting to see, when they look at the life of Jesus, when they look at these different pieces of the oral tradition, how it all fits together. But the earliest written source, I think, pretty clearly indicates his belief in the divinity of Jesus. Yeah.
Great presentation, thank you. I had a question about, in Mark, you didn't hinge your apologetic on the I am statement, but in Matthew, it's you've said it, and it's not that hard ego me, I am, referring to the divine name for God. So how do you answer that? Because I know some skeptics, whenever you point in Mark that he says I am, they'll go, well, he doesn't really say that.
Yeah, and that's a debatable point. I think in John it's very clearly spelled out, but maybe not so much in Mark or in Matthew. I think you can make a case that what's said in Mark and Matthew is at least consistent with what was said in John, but I'm certainly not trying to build my case based on those statements in Mark.
Right. Well, I mean, the Son of Man statements is what Jesus.
Yeah, the Son of Man statement, I think, is the biggest clue of Jesus' self-perception in Mark, and also throughout the Synoptic Gospels.
All right, can you talk just for a second about, in Mark 14, at the arrest of Jesus, it just glosses over it. They show up, he gives a kiss, they take him away. And in John 18, there's that moment where Jesus initiates the conversation and says, who are you looking for? And they were looking for Jesus, and he's, I am.
Right.
And then they all fall to the ground,
Right.
it says. And I can see why Mark would leave it out if he was writing to a Roman audience. Kind of embarrassing to see a bunch of Roman soldiers fall to
Right.
the ground. But, can you expand on, like, maybe why he left that out, or is John really dropping a tetragrammaton there, or?
Well, what I think fundamentally happens is you look across the differences of the Gospels; they have different theological agendas, and there's clearly some creative reasons for why they arrange the particular details the way they arrange the details. I think John has his reasons because I am is thematic throughout John. It's not really thematic in Mark. In fact, there's a sort of poetic symmetry that's in John that's really not in the Synoptic Gospels. And I don't think that takes away from the historicity of its claims, but it is clear that John artistically arranges things like 7, I am sayings, these sort of things. There's the 7 signs. There's a lot of symmetry in what John is doing that's not in the Synoptic Gospels, and I'm okay with that. To the skeptic who would discount John and say, well, that's a later addition to the narrative. That's not really there. I'd say, okay, but you still have to deal with Mark. You still have to deal with the sort of claims that are being made about Jesus in the Synoptics. And just what's being said about Jesus in the Synoptics is, at least in my opinion, internally consistent with what's happening in Mark and in narratives like that. So. Oh, sorry.
Since Mark and Peter were so close, could you use the letters of Peter in order to establish the views of Mark on the divinity?
Yeah, I mean, the traditional view is that Mark's gospel is Peter's gospel, and so I mean I don't know how broadly the more liberal or critical scholarship believes that, but that's certainly what we traditionally assert, is that we're getting really Peter's account in the Gospel of Mark, which is pretty significant, I think. Yeah, absolutely.
Please speak into the microphone.
What in Jewish culture does being a son connotate or equal being the same as? Is it a linguistic connection or ontological?
I think that you have descriptions of human beings as the sons of God in the Old Testament, and I don't think that that's in and of itself an assertion about Jesus' divinity in the slightest. I think the more important contextual things for me when I'm looking at Mark are these. I mean, if you look at the way in which the Son of Man is worshipped, and how he's revered in Daniel 7 as God, as having equal footing and authority with God. That's the thing that's so blasphemous in the minds of the Jews who hear Jesus make those assertions. Yeah.